My name is Lori Montgomery, and I was 26 years old when my life changed in an instant. It happened on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, while I was standing in the produce section of a grocery store a few blocks from my apartment. I was comparing 2 bags of spinach, treating it like the biggest decision of my day. One moment I was reading the nutrition label, and the next, the bright fluorescent lights above me began spinning in endless circles. My vision blurred, my legs gave out beneath me, and before I could understand what was happening, my body completely stopped cooperating. I reached for the shelf beside me, but my hand caught nothing but empty air. Then everything faded to black. The last thing I vaguely remember was hearing someone desperately shouting for help, a stranger, as I would later discover, not my own voice. I was taken to the emergency room unconscious. Later, the paramedics explained that my heart had slipped into a life-threatening rhythm, one that very few people survive without immediate medical intervention. An undiagnosed heart condition had triggered a severe arrhythmia, something no one had detected during my most recent physical examination. The doctors fought to stabilize me using procedures I only learned about afterward, piecing the story together from the people who had been there. At the time, I knew none of it. My memories of those hours simply didn't exist. One of the nurses, Priyanka, became a familiar face during the days that followed. She later told me that when I arrived at the hospital, my lips had already turned a frightening shade of blue, the kind of sight that unsettles even experienced emergency staff. Within the first hour, the hospital followed standard procedure and contacted my emergency contacts. The attending physician wanted my family there in case critical medical decisions had to be made while I remained unconscious. My mother answered the phone. I only discovered this 3 days later. Priyanka sat quietly beside my hospital bed, choosing her words with the gentle caution people use when they know they're about to break someone's heart. She explained that the hospital had reached my parents, but instead of rushing to my side, they said, "We can't. Your brother has a game." My younger brother, Dean, was preparing for a regional basketball tournament that weekend, a tournament much like the many others he had already played and would continue to play. According to Priyanka, my mother didn't hesitate before giving her answer. She spoke calmly, almost casually, as though she were declining a minor invitation instead of refusing to come see whether her daughter would survive the night. At that time, I knew nothing about their decision. I remained unconscious, connected to 4 lines and surrounded by machines that constantly monitored a heartbeat struggling to keep going. The physician overseeing my treatment, Dr. Aldous Reyes, later learned that a polite request wasn't enough. That same evening, he called my parents again. This time, he spoke plainly, explaining the seriousness of my condition without trying to soften the reality. He believed families deserve the truth, especially when every minute could matter. Even after hearing the doctors say that I might not survive the night, my parents still didn't come. According to the hospital's call records, which Priyanka later confirmed, my father took the second call. His response was almost impossible to believe. He told Dr. Reyes they would try to visit sometime the following week if things had settled down. As though I were dealing with a passing illness instead of fighting for my life. As though I weren't lying in an intensive care bed just 20 minutes away from the home where I had grown up. That first night passed in a haze of drifting consciousness. I floated in and out of awareness, catching fragments of conversations between nurses who assumed I couldn't hear them. Between those voices, I remember another kind of silence, the heavy, painful silence that fills a room when the people who are supposed to love you unconditionally choose to be somewhere else. It was the kind of silence that hurt almost as much as the illness itself. When I finally regained full consciousness nearly 2 days later, the very first thing I did was ask where my family was. When I finally opened my eyes and could think clearly again, the first question I asked the nurse was whether my parents had called. She paused for a moment, and in that silence I already knew the answer before she spoke. They hadn't called. They hadn't sent a text message. According to the hospital records, they hadn't even asked if I was alive or whether I had survived. During the next 5 days, I remained in that hospital room completely alone, slowly recovering while staring at the door every time it opened. Each time it wasn't them, something inside me quietly changed. Little by little, the hope I had carried for years began to The nurses became the closest thing I had to family. Priyanka would stop by during her breaks with magazines because she said she couldn't stand seeing me, so bored and lonely. Dr. Reyes also started spending extra time in my room, far longer than my medical chart probably required. I think he noticed the disappointment on my face every time footsteps echoed down the hallway but never stopped outside my door. He didn't say much about it, but somehow he understood exactly what I was waiting for. A full week after I had been admitted, my parents finally decided to come to the hospital. By then, however, something inside me had already shifted. My understanding of who they were and who I was in their lives had begun changing in ways I couldn't yet put into words. As I lay there with my heart slowly healing, another part of me was breaking beyond repair. I didn't realize it then, but the daughter who would eventually leave that hospital would never again be the same person who had entered it. Some wounds don't leave scars you can see, and no apology could ever erase what had already happened. When my parents finally arrived, they expected to find me lying in bed, grateful that they had shown up at all. Instead, they walked into an empty hospital room. The sheets had already been removed, the heart monitor was silent, and the bed where I had nearly died was ready for another patient. A nurse informed them that I had been discharged 3 days earlier. Later, my mother told one of my cousins that she felt strangely confused standing in that room, almost as if she had entered the wrong one. But the room number matched exactly what the hospital had given her on that first night, the same number she had hurriedly written down before returning her attention to Dean's basketball tournament. What they didn't know was that I never returned to my parents' house after leaving the hospital. Instead, my best friend Selwyn, whom I'd known since college, picked me up the moment I was discharged. Unlike my family, she had rushed to the hospital within an hour after receiving my message. Without asking questions, she brought me straight to her apartment and insisted I stay there as long as I needed. For 2 nights, Selwyn simply sat with me while I stared at the ceiling, replaying the same sentence over and over in my mind. Your parents chose a basketball game over your... At first, I cried until there were no tears left. Eventually, the sadness gave way to something quieter and much stronger. The disbelief faded, replaced by clarity. By the 3rd night, I wasn't crying anymore. I was making plans. During those 3 days, I finally found the courage to do something I had been avoiding for years. Almost dying alone had forced me to face a truth I had ignored my entire life. I called a moving company. With a little help, I went to my parents' house while they were both at work and gathered everything that belonged to me. Every box I had left behind after college, every photo album filled with childhood memories, every piece of my life that still existed inside those walls. I packed every reminder that I had ever called that house home. When I finished loading the last box, I looked around one final time. There was only one thing I chose to leave behind, a handwritten note placed carefully in the very center of the kitchen table. The note was waiting on the kitchen table, placed where I knew they couldn't possibly miss it the moment they walked through the front door. It wasn't long. It didn't need to be. Years of being overlooked had already spoken far louder than anything I could fit onto a single page. I wrote that I hoped Dean's basketball game had been worth missing the chance to see their daughter alive. I told them that a nurse named Priyanka had held my hand through the darkest night of my life after they were informed I might not survive. I reminded them that Dr. Reyes, a man who had known me for only a few days, had shown more compassion and concern than they had in 26 years. Then I wrote something I never imagined I would say. I wasn't angry anymore. Anger only exists when there's still hope that someone might change, and that hope had finally disappeared. The final lines were the hardest to write, yet they brought the greatest sense of peace. I told them I was done. I had removed myself from their address book, their phone contacts, and their lives just as completely as they had removed me from their list of priorities the moment caring for me became inconvenient. When they finally read the note, their reaction reached me weeks later through a conversation no one expected to happen. Dean eventually told Selwyn what he had seen that afternoon. According to him, our mother quietly lowered herself into a kitchen chair and read the letter once, then read it again without saying a single word. It was as though the meaning hadn't fully reached her the first time. My father picked up his phone, clearly intending to call me, but after staring at the screen for several seconds, he slowly put it back down. He realized there were no words left that could erase a silence that had lasted far too long. Dean was the only one who seemed to understand immediately why I had left. Later, he admitted something that changed how I viewed him. He confessed that he had overheard the hospital's first phone call and had begged our parents to go to me. They refused. They told him the basketball tournament mattered more because college scouts would be watching that weekend. Hearing that broke my heart, but it also confirmed that none of what happened had been my imagination. Someone else had witnessed it too. Over the months that followed, I slowly built a life where my value wasn't measured against someone else's schedule. Selwyn helped me find a small apartment across town. It was close enough to the hospital that every now and then I'd see Priyanka through the window of the coffee shop where she stopped each morning before work, and we'd wave at each other with quiet smiles. Dr. Reyes continued checking on my recovery with the occasional follow-up call, and somewhere along the way, Those simple conversations began to feel more like family than anything I'd ever experienced growing up. My parents eventually tried reaching out in every way they could think of. They contacted relatives, asked mutual friends to speak to me, and even sent a letter that accidentally found its way to me after being forwarded from my old address. I never answered. It wasn't because I wanted revenge or because I enjoyed making them suffer. It was because I had finally learned something I should have known all along. Real love doesn't wait until someone is lying in a hospital bed fighting for their life before deciding they're worth showing up for. Dean and I still speak from time to time. Our conversations are careful and slow, built on memories that survive despite everything else falling apart. I don't blame him for what happened, but rebuilding trust takes time. He's the only connection to that house I haven't completely let go of because I still remember the little boy who used to bring me water whenever I was sick, long before either of us understood the choices our parents would one day make. As for everyone else, I've stopped waiting by the door, hoping to hear footsteps from people who never truly chose me. Instead, I've surrounded myself with people who prove they would be there when it mattered most. Those are the footsteps I listen for now. Those are the people I proudly call my family. And in the end, I realize that family isn't defined by blood. It's defined by the people who stand beside you when your world is falling apart and never make you question whether you matter.